Well, it's time that we get started. Got plenty of nutmeg for today's episode. I'm going to need it. A little energizing of the drinks here. We're going to have lots of drinks today, so we're going to have fun with that. Welcome to the Nutmeg Tavern. We are live, and I'm your host, John Townsend. We have behind the bar, Ryan.
Hello.
There's Ryan. Good job, Ryan. And on the other side of the time vortex, taming all the wild, crazy gremlins going on because we're using extra technology today is Aaron.
Hey everyone, happy Friday. Let me know how everything looks and sounds because a lot of moving parts today.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. Special thanks to everyone out there who's part of, all those people that support us. And we have a special guest today, special two guests today, and they have been on the channel before. They've been on the channel in episodes where we covered whiskey and all kinds of good stuff. They've been on the episode in live streams even, or something close to a live stream. Yeah, it was a live stream, right? So we have Brian Cushing and Amy on the other side of a very long wormhole at this point. So there they are. Brian and Amy, tell us about, so people might have been sort of remember you from the Locust Grove episodes when you used to be there, but you are not at Locust Grove. Currently, you're working on new projects. I'm excited to hear about them, but quickly give the folks out there a nutshell. Who's Brian and Amy?
Well, great. Well, thank you all so much for having us. This is a thrill. We've missed being with you guys. But yeah, I think the central thing we're working on right here now is the Victorian Bar Room. And we're kind of researching the way that mixology was done in the Victorian period. And, this was an outgrowth of a lot of things, some of which did start at Locust Grove. Our work on the distillery and all that, which we explored quite a bit. So yeah, and that's, and I'm sure we'll get to this a bit later, but and that's all kind of related to what we talked about in those videos about distilling related to agriculture and things of that nature. Okay.
Hi. I'm Amy. And if people are wondering, I'm Brian's wife, in addition to partner and all sorts of things. So I got my start in living history back in 2013 out in San Francisco. Actually, I was doing the Dickens Christmas Fair out there, which was a really cool, very immersive theatrical type of living history. When I moved here, I met Brian. I got a real wonderful education on a lot of the material culture. And so we were involved at Locust Grove for a long time, actually. I was the theatrical director there and the ladies' costuming director. But all along, we've always had an interest in mixology and in alcohol. And Brian started really researching what that meant during our favorite time period, which is the Victorian period. And so when the world shut down and we all got a chance to kind of step back and say, hey, what's that project we've been putting off all this time? What's that thing we kept thinking about? We were sitting around and Brian came with this wonderful idea, like, let's do a YouTube show about Victorian drinking. And that's the Victorian Bar Room.
Very good. So the Victorian Bar Room, what's sort of your goal with the Victorian Bar Room? Where do you want to go with this?
Well, it's as far as it'll go, and I think really the whole reason we started actually, and Ryan articulated this better yesterday than I think I ever had, that, like I say, my passion is what I always wanted to be as a Victorian farmer, and that's not something you can just like go out and try really hard at and work hard and think you're going to sell a bunch of produce just because people want to eat it. I've seen too many hardworking farmers try and fail. And then when I discovered the alcohol angle, especially to apples, that was the big thing that really sent me. It's like to start the conversation with people, to try to build an identity and to try to build a brand, so to speak. We started talking about the end product and what to do with that, and then kind of back that into the agricultural product.
Yeah, it's really neat to dig into the history and understand some of these issues that are behind the idea of why people would be interested in alcohol, especially you're in the back country, or you're in areas that are newly settled, and yet
Right.
one of the first cash crops you've got is
Yeah.
something that is alcohol. So tell me about why that is.
Well, one thing is crop preservation. When it comes, whether it's grain or whether it's fruit, in an era without refrigeration, fermenting and distilling is a way to convert that crop into a portable, preserved commodity. They didn't miss that it felt good to drink. It's like some people talk about that. It's like, oh well, they didn't even notice that it felt great. But there was one case in early America where you could only put so much of your grain crop towards whiskey because obviously this was selling for a pretty good price. But as far as the function behind it, that's really it. And the source of alcohol that exists in any given area or associated with those areas is a direct outgrowth of the agriculture of what's being grown. Like here in Kentucky, we have bourbon is of course our famous thing, but it's a luxury now, really. I think Kentucky does a better job than a lot of places of dealing with farmers for its raw materials in bourbon. But you see these big industrial standalone distilleries. It started out as Kentucky whiskey made on farms because of the grain and because of the factors that are here in Kentucky. And that's the case with
Hold on. Okay, so tell me, I was thinking about, we always think about the grains, something like whiskey, but we don't think too much about the fruits specifically and how important they are. Not just, most people are thinking, grapes, and you're going to be making wine, but what's happening with things like persimmons and apples and pears, and how there's multiple different products that you're going to be able to get from that, and sort of squeezing them down, if you know what I mean, into different products.
Yeah, pretty much any fruit, even on into the vegetable families, can be changed into brandy, and anything that could pretty much was. Alan Bishop, who was on the show with us with the brandy, we've been having a lot of discussion about squash brandy. That hasn't been a thing. So that was all. If it could be turned into alcohol, it pretty much was. Apples in this region specifically has been a tragic loss just in the past 100 years. Bourbon came back after Prohibition and brandy didn't. Part of the problem with that was if they caught you during Prohibition, if they caught you making brandy, they wouldn't just bust your still; they'd cut down your whole orchard. And so when Prohibition ended, it was easy enough to bring grain crops back. It wasn't so easy to bring these orchards back, especially when you're talking about cultivated varieties. These old varieties, some of which we'll probably never see again. And I really started to comprehend that during the Locust Grove project, actually. And again, with a lot of the projects I've done, Alan Bishop and me have talked about together, I just really discovered a passion for this recreation of this spirit that was just as big of a part of our spirit landscape in this region as bourbon is, but nobody remembers.
Yeah, it was like a really, really important part of industry in this area. I've just been started doing a Diderot's, kind of talking about Diderot's and looking at the plates of Diderot's and Townsends Plus live streams. And the next episode is going to cover a lot of looking at the mills for crushing things like apples, and the presses for pressing out apples and grape things, and seeing the massive industry that they had just for those things. We can do those. You can do those in a very, very primitive situation with just, one guy in his farm and a few helpers, maybe even his children. And then you see these other circumstances where they have these giant machines, even in the 18th century, to press out these things and turn them into really, really important agricultural products, and distilling them, fermenting them.
Absolutely.
It's crazy to think that there's all these breeds of apples that we're just never going to get back that used to exist, because American apples have become so homogenized, and now if we sneak in, maybe a few extra, we think the grocery store has gotten very exciting. If there's 5 or 6 plants, apples or types of apples.
Yeah, there was no Red Delicious.
Yeah, and it just, there used to be so many, like hundreds that people were growing. We did heritage apples and what was available, and it's incredible.
Yeah, you wonder if there are ways to get back to some of those cultivars that are maybe they've lost or they've gone wild, and maybe they're reclaimable in some ways, or we just need to, work at maybe once they're hybridized away from those things, there's no, you let it go wild and it's turned into something completely different. So
there are some people out there, and I've learned about this adjacently to him, but there's a few really interesting success stories of people who will find the last little tree that's got one last little fruit that's hiding tucked away somewhere somebody didn't realize for 80 years and try to find a few of these. But yeah. I think there's so many more we're just never going to get back.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So are we going to make a drink or what?
Well, later, but we can do that up front if you want to.
Oh, well, we can talk a little bit about. Let's talk about the your YouTube experience real quick. So we've been here doing YouTube for a bazillion years, and we forget because we've been doing it for so long about the struggles. And of course, YouTube is a totally different place now. So tell me about how your YouTube experience is going.
Well, positive, I would say, and I will say, giving credit where credit is due, you guys were certainly an inspiration. Getting to work with you guys and see how it's done, and to actually be on the Nutmeg Tavern set, it led to a lot of understanding that I would not have had otherwise. I'll say the publicity and the social media know-how is 99% in Amy's court.
So spaghetti at the wall.
So it's like I'll come up with the content and things like that, but promotion's really in her realm. It's slow going. It's hard to get you to let people notice you. It's certainly picked up a little bit recently. One of our biggest challenges is even, I think to this day, I haven't tried it since we've reached 500 subscribers, but if you go to the browser in YouTube and you type in the Victorian Bar Room in its entirety, it will ask you, do you mean the Victorian bathroom? Strange things like that.
That's tough.
Every day, and it still asks me, aren't you sure you mean Victorian bathroom?
Yeah. So that's got things a challenge. People in general have been wonderful. We haven't really had a whole lot of bad experience with viewers. And it's a mix of people. It's not just living history people, it's people just kind of even casually interested in drinking. And the most gratifying thing I think for us is when people watch the video, they go away, they try it, and they're successful at it. Because that's really the point. We're not necessarily, really hope people who are into mixology and know what they're doing are interested in all that, but we want anybody who is just got a spark of an interest. If they don't have any mixing gear, they've just got tablespoons and teaspoons in the kitchen drawer, that they can go away and try this stuff and actually get this experience of the past for themselves without having to, be some big part of anything yet, So that's been the most rewarding, is actually helping people to explore these experiences of the past who might not have otherwise.
So we throw out terms, when we say 18th century, we mean a particular thing. When you say Victorian, what years are you trying to focus in on?
We are literally talking about 1837 to 1901.
There we go.
So that's the year that Victoria inherited the throne from her uncle William IV, and she died in January 1901. So she didn't very much make it. Didn't much make it into 1901, but before that, the period before that, when you're talking about like the Regency in England, we have the Federal here and the Empire in France and all that. But the neat thing about Victoria is that she gave her name to the whole period everywhere, pretty much. And so when we talk about the Victorian period, that's really what we're talking about. We're hoping to get more into earlier stuff. We've gotten as early as 1840 with our recipes. A lot of the stuff really starts to pick up around mid-century, because that's when mixology is starting to change from what it had been like since the 18th century, even before that, when the pace of life is starting to quicken, thanks largely to the steam engine. You had the steamboat, and then you had the railroad just change the whole landscape of people's lives, and that was reflected in how they drank. And so that's a lot of what we look at, this transition from a batch cocktail, like a bowl of punch, you might sit around for a couple of hours with your friends, to a glass. You might not be drinking with anybody. You might be drinking very quick. The other thing that happens at that point is people start to write down the bartender's trade. And so the first time that happened was 1862. With Jerry Thomas, very famous book, one of the best ever written to date. But nobody had really written down the bartender's trade prior to that. It was just like any other trade. It got passed down master to apprentice. But when Jerry Thomas wrote it down, he opened the floodgates. And the further you get into the period, the more writing people were doing. So there's a lot of great information out there.
So as you're researching, you're getting into this, pre-1860 or so. And of course, research is much harder. Which we find like tremendously, right? So usually you just get kind of a description. If you're lucky, you might know all the ingredients that they used. What are your techniques for digging into those harder time periods? What are the tricks you've found so far about, and this is for me, these other folks, they can listen along, but go ahead and tell me about your tricks for digging in and understanding drinks before this first Barman's Guide comes out.
It's interesting. It's a lot, before I started, I'm sure we've all had a lot of this experience whenever we've been interested in starting to interpret something from the past. The first people who speak up are either the people who tried and failed or heard it was impossible, so they repeat that it's impossible. And so I listened to that a lot. And, I'd seen Jerry Thomas's book and I'd been kind of interested, but I'd heard people say, it's like, oh, you don't even know what he's talking about. There's no way. It's too confusing and things like that. Well, finally one day it's like, I'm just going to get a copy and see what I think. And really, it was already having the mentality from interpreting period food recipes that made that approachable. And so you're going to screw up at first in a few ways. First, in measurements, and secondly, in ingredients. The first versions of these I did not have the right ingredients. It was fun. They were fun screw ups. But, you just you learn as you go. You read about the characteristics and the products that are available. And then, of course, measurements is a big thing. For me, any point during the period, I guess especially in the early part of the period, it's just a matter of learning the language. And so a lot of times they measure in wine glasses. And that goes way back. And so people will think, you say wine glass and people think something like this, because that's about the size of our wine glass. That's a goblet to them. A wine glass is that, okay? So, for me, I started reading this stuff and I had already started collecting Victorian glassware. It was just kind of a side passion of mine. We featured on the show a lot. And I had several different Victorian wine glasses from across a range of the period. And so literally I just set them all out one day and took a tablespoon and dumped water into all of them until they were full and figured out, what the number of tablespoons translated to the number of ounces of those wine glasses was. Later, then I wound up consulting a book that had addressed this issue, and it was the same answer, so I felt pretty good about it. But it's just a matter of digging in, embracing it, not being afraid to screw up, and just learning as you go,
Okay, so we've got some more viewers on real quick. I'm going to interrupt to do some super chat stuff,
Okay.
But we also need to reintroduce our guests.
Okay, good.
So real quick, there's Lawless, often watched to escape this crazy world for time, just to be reminded, to my benefit, of the things men across time will always have in common.
Very good.
Heather Torrey, welcome to the Namek Tavern. Ocean Eyes sends in a donation without a comment. Ashley LeCount is in Super Chat and says, I have loved every video Brian has done with Townsends and have watched them all numerous times. His passion for living history is so evident. Keltoid5 sends in some emojis with John's face and tainted brain.
Whoa.
Trying to send a message to you.
Okay.
And we've got, it looks like, a new member. So thank you for that. And then somebody said they can't hear me.
Yeah, I got it.
Oh, you got me. Gotcha.
We have a little mic mishap.
Okay, cool.
My mic's not even on.
Okay.
Sorry, there has been a little bit of an audio mishap, but it is fixed now. Sorry about
Who's
that.
in charge back
So
there?
Not me.
hopefully you heard some of that.
They're all very good super chats. You just gotta believe us.
Piratical Nonsense Productions says, were there any bouncers in pubs and taverns in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, or was it down to barmen owners to eject people who were too drunk?
You probably largely would have been looking at the barkeep themselves and possibly the other patrons.
Yeah.
There was, I think in the cities as opposed to the frontier at the end of the 19th century, the culture was a little bit different. But especially in the cities where you had a system of regulars, they could probably be helped with security as well. But it's pretty much up to the bartender. You hear things about the towns in the West, on the frontier, which is really kind of where my fascination with history began. You also had the lawmen pretty well on hand at that time. We read about like Dodge City with Pat Masterson, Platter, and all that.
There we go.
All right, that catches us up on Super Chat for now. We're going to reintroduce our guests, and also you guys feel free to fire in some questions for them, and I'll try my best to get to them.
Yeah, so I have with us today, you can see him over there on the other side of the screen, Brian Cushing and Amy, his wife, and they have a YouTube channel called the Victorian Bar Room, not bathroom, and you will find it on YouTube. So if you found
and John, you just gave us the best wedding announcement we could have asked for.
There you go.
Oh,
No, we actually got married during the pandemic, and we forget who we've told. So this was effective.
Well, you said it, not me. I mean,
Yes. Oh no, we're appreciative.
Start coming out.
there you go. And if you're interested in this Victorian time period, so about, say, approximately 100 years after what we do, almost sort of, you can transfer it like that. There they are doing the drinks in a Victorian bar room. And it is a fascinating study, an important part of what's going on with what life was like in this time period. And we can see all sorts of characters. The time period would be, Dickens is usually writing earlier than that, but we transfer some of his works into the 1840s. Or maybe we can see, all sorts of let's say literary characters in that Victorian bar room, maybe Sherlock Holmes or somebody like that. Amy earlier was mentioning Gilbert and Sullivan right there in that time period is a great time period, and we have a lot of fun with that, with period movies and those kinds of things. And sometimes we get to see their interpretation of Victorian bar rooms. What do you think about film representations of Victorian bar rooms?
Wow, that's a big question. The thing is, Victorian bar rooms themselves were so all over the page.
Yeah.
A lot of times, I think since the 90s, a lot of movies have been veering more into the researched realm. Even if they don't quite get it right, you can see the effort, you can see where they were going with it. I think it was the Pride and Prejudice really started that. In the 90s, but no, a lot of times I think it's pretty good. When you see all the very fancy fittings and things like that, the big mirrors and the highly polished bar and all the nice stuff that went into a bar, that's real. Because especially once you start to work into the later part of the century, those bars would be kind of sponsored by or even run by the breweries and things like that. And so they would fix these places up, very fancy. And there's a book that I've been reading right now called Faces Along the Bar, where it's a study of bar culture at the end of the 19th and 20th century. And it made the point that part of the charm for especially working class men going to the bar is they get to exist in an atmosphere that might be something they can't afford anyplace else. They don't have it at home. They're not staying in fancy hotels, but they can go to the saloon, and it's been kitted out, and they can be a part of basically their own club there. On the other end of the spectrum is some of the stuff you see out west, and this is not this isn't every bar out west, right out of the gate, in the gold rush, you had better stocked San Francisco bars than you had out east in some cases. But especially these frontier towns, they didn't always wait to have the walls finished going up before they opened the bar. You would have the frame and you cover it in canvas and then side it as you could. And so it was all over the page. But you see that in movies too. There's some great westerns out there. I think Wyatt Earp with Kevin Costner comes to mind. Was one of the early ones I saw really portray that. Is basically the structure's framed up and you put a tent over it. And so they didn't wait too long to start selling the whiskey.
Yeah, I think we can forget, especially in very post-temperance time periods, how much different society was in our 17th or our 18th century and 19th century time periods, how sort of more free that was. The idea of people selling drinks, walking around and selling drinks in the 18th century in some places, like in Great Britain, it's like, oh, there's this street seller of gin. It's like, okay, my mind is blown. Do you have any thoughts about, 19th century things that we would in our post-prohibition time frame say, what was going on?
Oh, yeah. Well, and you raise a really good point here because prohibition seems so far away, but we're still living with the effects of it. And in some ways, it never really did end. We can drink again, but the stranglehold that regulation and things like that have on the industry is much more immense than it was at that point. And it's under the pretense of safety, but it's also how industrialized and what big business concern has been worked into this. And that really first got driven home for me when we were starting the Locust Grove Distillery project. And I went down to Kentucky Distillers Association. We're just talking through like legal ins and outs. And one of the first things they told me is the main agency you have to be worried about is the TTB, Tax and Trade Bureau. So people are getting their cut, and there's big lobby. There's big lobbying that goes into that with keeping the money at the top. And so while that did exist during the Victorian period, it was certainly not on that scale. Especially when it came to beer, which was still generally locally produced until you had refrigerated rail cars. And so there's something right there. There weren't a whole lot of national brands of beer. I think Bass was one of the early ones to bottle at the end of the 18th century. And
go ahead.
Yeah. But that wasn't the norm, that you would have these national brands. So your beer was necessarily a more locally produced thing. And especially in the earlier part of the period, that would mean you had greater variance of grain also. And so both the maker and the grain themselves, you have more variance in. And so that's something I think would shock you if you got back to the Victorian period. You didn't, until the very end, buy whiskey by the bottle. It was shipped in barrels. And actually, I've got kind of a representation right here. You would take a jug or a flask like this to the saloon, and you'd have that filled up, and you take it on home. Unfortunately, people did adulterate those barrels in some pretty nasty ways, and so that's why the bottling started. Another thing, one that comes to mind about shocking at the end of in the 19th century, there was a case in Dodge City. There was a notorious character named Luke Short, and he decided that he needed some more money one day, and so he hitched up a bunch of barrels of whiskey in a wagon, and he rode around the frontier and sold them, until he was out. And then he went back to Dodge City and started making money another way. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right about how free it was. Buckets of beer, beer also was largely dispensed in whatever container you had when you went to the saloon, and you would send your kid to do it. You didn't necessarily do it yourself. This little Johnny comes in with Dad's bucket and gets it filled up with beer and takes it mostly back to Dad. But those are a few of the top things that come to mind.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing about it used to be so common to just go get an amount of beer. And I think that's part of a change, that it's not just about prohibition. It's, starting the late 19th century, 1880s, 1890s, single prepackaged stuff comes in. And that changes everything. Alcohol is part of a bigger picture there. Mm-hmm. That's when packaging comes in. And today we're thinking, oh my gosh, what do we do with all this packaging? But 140 years ago, that was billed as, it's clean, it's healthy if it's prepackaged, it wasn't adulterated. And it's the same thing with alcohol, is now we go buy however many individually packaged beers. And a lot of the beer brands that say they go back a long ways are really going back to that time, like Bass was just one of those first ones. Mm-hmm. Anchor Steam out of San Francisco traces itself to a company from that time. And I'll say, for a living history standpoint, realizing it doesn't have to be that way was sort of an eye-opener for us, because anybody who does living history has had this moment of trying to find the glass that will hold a beer while you are out at your event. And when we just started bringing like a growler or a bottle of wine, That's so much easier.
So real quick, we got some questions building up. One in particular was about cocktails, and something of note here is that between our time period and your time period, something major changes with mixed drinks. It's really hard to find recipes for mixed drinks in the 18th century. There are a few, you see references of people talking about them, but not really any recipes. So when did cocktails come into play, and how did that change between the two time periods?
Well, it really started in the 18th century. It wasn't as common at that point, but you did have a few individual drinks, especially in the United States. They might be chilled rather than heated, with punch being so often served hot, but not always. And so the nucleus was already there in the 18th century. You had some very simple things that were like syrup, a spirit, some lemon, things like that. It was called a sling, basically. The theory is basically the mint julep came out of a sling, which was this kind of early personal mixed beverage. As you start to work into the 19th century, bitters start to make their way into the beverages. And then it was called a cocktail. Why it was called a cocktail, whether it was because it had the variety of the tails of the cock, we don't know. But bitters up to that point had been an exclusively medicinal product. Okay, it was to settle your stomach, and all bitters is a very heavily infused neutral spirit. With herbs and botanicals, and the idea for it was to be medicinal. It was considered very scandalous when you started putting that in a recreational drink, basically using medicine for recreation. But we see this throughout the whole evolution of alcohol, and we're going to talk about one here in a bit. I know that Ryan has some of behind the bar that started out as a remedy, and so that was the first cocktail when you had these. When you had this combination of spirit, citrus, some sugar, and some bitters. So it took a while for that to become accepted. But as you're starting to enter our period, the Victorian period, it is more accepted. But cocktail, and one thing we get into on the channel, that is a specific category of mixed beverage. There are those certain categories that qualify as a cocktail. Now, in the 21st century, that's morphed into, if we're going out for mixed drinks, we're going out for cocktails. No matter what it might be. But for the Victorians, the different categories, whether it's a cocktail, a julep, a sangaree, a punch was also starting to morph into a personal beverage. That was a little bit more evident. So did I answer that question? Did I get off on a tangent?
No, that's a great answer.
Okay.
Heather Torrey is in Super Chat. I especially enjoyed the Absinthe episode.
And hello to Heather Torrey. She was our biggest supporter in season 1.
Oh, look at that.
Good job, Heather.
Wonderful. Thank you, Heather. Desiree Gonzalez is in Super Chat. Have you done features on Cato Alexander, John Dabney, or R.R. Bowie, or J. Burke Edelin, and other pioneers?
No, those have not been on our radar exactly.
And then Phil Klum is in Super Chat. Did alcohol consumption increase or decrease per capita during the Victorian era?
Decrease, was it?
I would say decrease.
Decreased, but you're decreasing from an especially soaked era. The Regency or the Federal period was very heavy drinking, and so while it did decrease during the Victorian period, the norm, I think, was still more than we would usually think of being a normal amount to drink. It was just more of an integrated part of life.
Queen Victoria is a really good example. When she became queen, so many people were very happy to see her as this young, sort of innocent girl compared to her uncles who'd been, her uncle William IV, or George IV is the one who notoriously would drink so much port before a party. He'd show up and throw up on the ballroom floor. Victoria still drank. Queen Victoria enjoyed her scotch and soda. She just wasn't overdoing it the way her notorious uncles had. Doesn't mean she was about, she was not a teetotaler or anything like that.
Yeah, so it's decreased with that qualification of how much was done during the Regency period.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we can, as I was mentioning about Prohibition didn't pop out of nowhere.
Right.
It wasn't like these, good things are happening, but we're gonna, come down on these people. We have to remember that was a product of abuses that were going on. So I don't want to just, jump over that and say prohibition was the worst thing ever. I don't think it did the right things necessarily, but obviously it came from some problem.
Well, the other thing to remember about that too is the temperance movement evolves over time. It's like at one point when you get to prohibition, it's prohibiting the production and sale of all alcohol. At one point in the 19th century, beer and wine were temperance beverages. Those lower alcohol content things.
Walk it back from all the gin.
Yeah, they just didn't want the
beer.
sweetness.
Right, like gin. Is it gin?
Gin
Alley?
Lane.
What? Gin Lane and Beer Alley, right? That's even a problem way back in the 1740s when they're having this real big gin problem. It's like, how do we get people to stop doing this? Well, beer is the answer to that.
Yeah. Well, it was such an important part of your calorie intake too, especially in English.
Yeah, I think it's William Cobbett who has the anti-tea rant.
Yeah, there is. Yeah. It's at the very.
You know the one I'm talking about, John. You're nodding.
Yeah, there are multiple things like tea. This tea stuff is bad for you. Coffee's bad for you. Probably a nice beer is going to be a porter or something is going to be better for you.
Beer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in Super Chat, number 1, the absinthe subject keeps coming up. So we're going to have to take some time to talk about that. Real quick, in the Super Chat Max are cool. Could someone think about the rise of cocktails as a way to have an individualized version of 18th century punch, sort of like a micro punch bowl?
That's exactly what it is. And the reason that happened was because of the pace of life. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think people have probably come in since then. But you cannot overstate the difference that the steam engine made in the pace of people's lives, what they had available to them, and all of that. And the rise of the individual or the communal mixed beverage, is a direct symptom of that. That is going on as the railroads are starting to tear across continents. The pace of life picked up.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, I'm always struck because he's the one who's explored most of this. I get to be the taster. And I've always been really struck that the earlier ones really are like punch in a glass. A lot of them really are, you made me an individual punch. And then by the 1880s and 90s, people are taking it further and you get the proto versions of what we're used to today, the very early Manhattans, early martinis. But the first ones are absolutely like, it's an individualized little like single serving punch. Cool.
Robert Green is asking about Oliver Twist and whether or not it was popular when it was written and when it was written.
It was popular. It was slightly pre-Victorian, right?
Yes, and I used to know the year off the top of my head, and you'll catch me here. I've slipped in my Dickens, because he had already written Oliver Twist when Victoria was crowned, as I remember, and he'd done Pickwick Papers, and then Twist, I think, was still coming out in serial. That was it. Because I know at that point Dickens was sort of successful enough that he could afford a nice room actually over a pub. Dickens' family rented a nice room over a pub along the Coronation Parade trail so they could watch the Queen go by. But, he hadn't reached the fame later that he would when he actually met Victoria.
But he was a celebrity in his own time.
Oh, yeah. No, Pickwick Papers did it first, and then Twist was doing the same thing. It was his follow-up that showed he was not a one-trick pony by any means. And Dickens is actually a really good example of this transition because, he's born in 1812. He's born in the era of the big bowls of punch, and he loved punch. Mm-hmm. He would carry his own nutmeg grater with him. So when he went visiting, he could sort of, I love writing, but I could see him just pushing in his way as a guest in there to be like, I'll handle this. And he loved punch. But yeah, he dies in 1870. And by that time, that transition to much more what we think of as how to drink is very much already happened.
Dickens actually commented on this. There was a pub that he went to that just a few years, I think it was in the 1850s, and just a few years before, everybody's punch bowls were arrayed on a shelf behind the bar, ready for him to use. And then he goes in there a few years later, and they're in a corner. They're in a pile in the corner. Nobody's using them anymore.
So there's one more super chat here from Otas85. Was there a large variety of spirits available for mixed drinks, or was it based on region and class?
Oh, both. And here's the thing about spirits is that their importance to agriculture is that they can be packaged and shipped. It's a preserved, shippable commodity at that point. They almost certainly had a bigger variety than we do. We think of ourselves as having all this access to stuff, but it's all largely it's a lot of industrialized stuff. But you had smaller concerns in distilling, especially early in the period. You had more variety of grain going into the stuff. Definitely, region by region, you're going to see regional differences. You can get regional spirits other places easier than you can get regional beer because of the refrigeration problem. But a couple of things that people are still working on rediscovering right now is both Pennsylvania and Maryland style rye. That died out in Prohibition, and there's some good work being done in it. But yeah, all of that is definitely the case. Class also, yes. Cognac, enormously popular during the Victorian period, and so they're pretty common as well. But that's not the usual swill you're going to fill your jug in to end your day with at home.
Dickens is another good example because what is it? Bob Cratchit's drinking at home on Christmas.
That's a good point. Yeah. Usually, the most popular things to make punch out of were brandy, often cognac, and rum. And one of the cues in A Christmas Carol that Bob Cratchit isn't doing so well is they refer to his gin punch. Gin punch was always a workaround.
And he comes in the next day kind of feeling it.
Yeah.
He doesn't know Scrooge is reformed yet, and he says he's a little late because he had been making rather merry the night before.
Yes.
So he might be feeling that gin.
What do you think, Ryan?
That's back to you now, John.
Maybe we should get this drink done before we run out of time.
Let's do it. Yeah. Well, the way I usually do this in demos is I mix the drink, then talk about it, because I figure people want to actually get to the drinking of it. So this one is mixed in the glass, which makes it easy. We're using a goblet today. This is from the 1880s. And if you look at the paintings of people drinking absinthe during the Victorian period, a lot of them are using just plain goblets like this. And the specialized absinthe classes evolved out of that. And the date on this one is 1888. So we're right in time. We are going to do just a teaspoon of an anisette liqueur. This is still very easy to get. It's not, or 2 teaspoons. It's not expensive.
Get that Total Wine?
Yeah, you can get a Total Wine. 2 teaspoons of that. We're going to take our absinthe, and we're probably going to have a long conversation about it here in a minute. That we're only going to do 1 ounce of. Now, if you're along and you don't have any equipment, a tablespoon is half a fluid ounce. So if it calls for 1 ounce, you're just looking at 2 tablespoons.
It's a great sound effect we're getting on the mic.
That is. Okay, we are going to put a couple of ice cubes in it. Ice is freezing together. And give it a quick stir.
Well, that smells so good. You can already smell the aromatics.
So it's going to get chilled down by giving it a stir. It's in the glass with the ice. It's okay to let it get diluted. And the next one's real easy. It can be either seltzer or soda water. And we're going to do 1.5 ounces of that. A lot of times that's a shot. In the Victorian period, it's referred to as a jigger, which still sticks around today. Get it nice and stirred up. Not so much that you disturb the carbonation. I think we are ready to go. I'll wait for John to get his before I taste.
It's coming over. Here we go. There it is. Mine didn't have as much ice in it.
Ooh, that's a beautiful goblet.
John, we missed you. Good to see you.
There we go. I am not familiar with absinthe. I can definitely get that that licoricey flavor going on in there. This didn't have a whole lot of fizzy left to it. Maybe he defizzed it for me. I don't know. Very, very a fun kind of drink, and I wouldn't have guessed it would have been like that. Tell me about, well, what do you get from it?
Everything you're talking about, it's the intense aroma of all the botanicals that go into absinthe. And and that is really kind of at the core of the issue. Absinthe is probably the most mythologized, for better and worse, of spirits that are out there because it was illegal, because of a marketing campaign, and that was all. The absinthe is produced, it's one of a number of things that developed 17th century or prior that started out as a remedy, made its way into recreation, that is, it's the spirit, the base spirit is distilled to a neutral point. So it can be either grain-based or fruit-based. So it can start out as basically whiskey or brandy. But once you start to get to a high enough proof, you start to lose the character of the base ingredient, okay? Because you're getting closer to pure alcohol. And so that's what happens when you do that. And then it is infused either 1 or 2 times with a heavy load of botanicals. Now, the way this was actually done during the Victorian period, you might actually have an equal botanical spirit ratio. It's usually much less than that now because of some things that have happened politically. Now, absinthe had started its journey into recreational use during the 18th century. Okay, so but by the Townsend time, absinthe is already a factor as far as on the drink scene. It didn't reach the popularity that it eventually did until the 1870s or 80s because of what happened to the wine crop over in Europe, the wine grape crop. It had a disease that just way killed production for a few years. Now, in places like Switzerland and France and places like that, you have less wine available. People still wanted, their tipple. And so what do you turn to? Here's this convenient absinthe. It's a very high proof spirit. I think the one Ryan said one you've got is 120. That's the lower end of what they usually come in at. But it was there. It was available. It was convenient. And so the way we've prepared it, the way absinthe is prepared, it's proofed it down to like drinking a glass of wine. Okay, that doesn't mean that nobody abused it. I mean, people always abuse these things. But that's generally how it was taken. Now, one of the main botanicals that you taste in absinthe is wormwood. Wormwood does contain a chemical called thujone. And thujone taken in certain quantities can cause you health problems. As the wine industry started coming back, they started really selling this idea that thujone was making people do all these horrible things from absinthe. The absinthe is making people go insane. It's making people kill their family. It's doing all these horrible things because they needed it out of the way so they could be selling their wine again. And the idea took hold and stuck. You did have temperance movements underway. That didn't hurt. It was associated with kind of like counterculture people, artists, impressionists, these kind of edgy artistic types that already look a little bit dangerous. And so that helped. But, by the time you get to the early 20th century, this stuff is starting to be outlawed in a number of countries, and it stuck. And you still hear these myths repeated to this day. What happened around, I think, the 90s is there started to be a push to bring absinthe back. And there were tests done on modern bottles of absinthe made to the correct, the correct recipe, and antique bottles of absinthe that were left over. And what the test showed was that there was very trace levels of thujone actually distills over into the finished product. It's not anything that's going to affect you. And so if you've ever cooked with fresh sage, that has exponentially more thujone in it than you ever get from absinthe. You would be dead of alcohol consumption first. There are other beverages, other infused drinks like this that have been grandfathered into the system that have more thujone than they're still allowed to let distill over into absinthe. And so That's what it is. It was all marketing. It was all politics. Luckily, it's really coming back. And so those people who say it's like, well, it's not real absinthe. Yes, it is real absinthe. A couple of the ones that I'm excited about that are pretty available. St. George here has been one of our go-tos lately. This comes from California. And it's just a really nice product. It is a Verde, so it has that secondary infusion that gives it the green color. Our buddy Alan Bishop, who we worked with on that last distillery film we all did together. He is at Spirits of French Lick, and he is an absinthe aficionado. I mean,
this one's my favorite.
Yeah, this is Amy's very favorite. Alan is in deep on absinthe. He knows more about it than probably anybody. I've learned a lot just standing listening to him. But this is one that he produces up there. It's very approachable. It's called a Le Bleu. So it actually comes out in a kind of a milky white once you put everything in it. So that's a good one. And he specifically made this to be an accessible, affordable absinthe that people can get. So highly recommend that one. And the reason why we like to do cocktails like this is because, everybody, when they think about absinthe, everybody knows about the water dripping through the sugar cube. And that's a wonderful way to do it. We've done that a lot. But what we really, you can find plenty of videos on that. We really like to drive home the point that during the Victorian period, especially 1880s and 90s, there were all these different ways to prepare absinthe. The absinthe Suzette, this being only one of them. Absinthe also started finding its way into lots of other cocktails. And so it's a broad, wonderful world that is ripe for rediscovering right now. And so that's one of the big messages we're trying to get out is the glories of absinthe and all the wonderful things you can do with it.
Again, just to hone in on what you said, is a lot of people don't realize absinthe was a common ingredient in other mixed drinks in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. Because to them, it wasn't this exotic, forbidden thing. To us, we think, oh, why would you dilute it? It's absinthe. And in the 19th century, they're like, yeah, it's absinthe. It's good. There's so much more you can do with it. So, it's one of the key ingredients in the Victorian Manhattan.
Yeah, one of the early Manhattans really actually has absinthe in it.
But it's just a little. It's being used as a dash.
It's a dash, yeah.
Yeah. So we actually started playing around the other night, and I like a modern martini. I will admit, I was raised by martini drinkers. I read a bar manual once, a modern one, that said martini drinkers will be the pickiest customers you will ever have. And my point on that is just my head has an idea of what a martini tastes like. You give me a Victorian one, I'm like, I'm sorry, I was raised on modern. But man, we tried a little absinthe in there. Oh, that was real nice. So the Victorian era can give us so many more ideas on how to prepare drinks.
Super. That sounds like a lot of fun. I'm going to jump in really quick because we're going to run out of time, and I better get this done before we run out, is the Patreon names and all those people that help support what we do. So I try to get to these guys every week. Sometimes I forget, but this week I didn't. So brand new Patreons. Patreon supporters this week. Zach, and then Madam Homebody. And just right before the live stream started, Cynthia Main. And then we've got folks that help us out on PayPal. Peter Schiller. Christopher Ford is in there again. Martina Tedders. And then somebody sent me a helper donation in snail mail. Can you believe it? In an actual envelope. So Julia Jacobs, thanks for that. And then brand new T Plus people. Townsends Plus, Greg J, Sarah N, Lauren K, Nicole Helen V, Linda R, Jeff M, Jennifer K. Wow, lots and lots of folks there. And maybe, just maybe, we can trick Brian and maybe even Amy to be on Townsends Plus, to do something on Townsends Plus.
We would love that. We've been talking about it. Yeah. Ryan is. We've had some conversations, and there's certainly plenty of Victorianism to go around.
Well, I've got some catching up to do over here. Heather Torrey in Super Chat says, that looks opalescent. Can you tell us the ingredients one more time and the name of the drink?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, it is. Very easy. 2 teaspoons of anisette liqueur. Very easy to get, not expensive. 1 ounce of absinthe, or that's 2 tablespoons if you don't have an ounce measure. Stir it up, put some ice in it, stir it till it's kind of chilled. put 1.5 ounces of either soda or seltzer water in it. Give it a stir to combine everything, but not so much that you get rid of the fizz, and you're ready to go. That's the 1888 Absinthe Suzette. You don't need any special equipment. It's a wonderful way to take absinthe, and they're all a little bit different. One thing I will say is you usually don't want to fall very far below $50 on an absinthe. And that sounds like a lot, but a regular cocktail with a regular spirit often includes 2 ounces of spirit. You're only usually going to be using 1 ounce of absinthe. So you're going to get a lot more come around it.
It's potent.
All right. So this is Super Chat. I'm going to try this name. I think it's Simon Tully Batiste, but it comes in without a comment.
Thank you.
Rose McGinn is in here. Please tell us about the history of cordials. And do you have anything on that?
History of Cordials. Do you want to talk on that one, John?
No, I was going to let you do that.
Yeah, it pretty much that goes well back before the Victorian period, and that's basically you've got it was a bit of a road to get into the point where distilled spirits were the pleasant, mellow, sippable. Not that they were all bad. I think that's overstated as well. But especially early on, especially here in America, if you've got a small farm distilling operation, you're only pulling a few gallons off at a time. That's not necessarily going to go into a barrel. It might go into a jug. Okay, so you've got a raw white spirit usually at that time, and today you can still buy them. They're called new make. So it's the same thing as punch was. It was a way to dress it up, make it accessible, and so you're combining it with things like sugar, fruit, spices, letting it kind of steep and mellow, and then you serve it that way. The one that always comes to mind for me is Cherry Bounce, because it was a favorite of George Rogers Clark's, and I worked at the last home with George Rogers Clark for a long time.
There we go.
One more super chat from Alexander Kent. Cheers, friends. Can you describe what goes into classic Victorian punch bowls?
What goes into classic Victorian punch as far as the ingredients, right?
I'm assuming.
Yeah, it's almost always a combination of some balance of a few things. Oftentimes, the first step is to peel some lemons, and when you peel it, you don't need anything special. Again, you can use just a vegetable peeler from your kitchen, but you want to peel it where you've got mostly yellow. Okay, you want to leave behind as much of the white as possible, and you'll muddle that in some sugar. You'll let it sit for a half hour or an hour, and over that half hour or an hour, the sugar is going to draw those oils out of the lemons. Usually, you'll put that into a bowl, maybe with some more sugar, depending on the recipe. You'll combine that with the easiest way to do it is room temperature water. Unless it's going to be a hot punch, then you very well might be using boiling water. And so you dissolve that. It is important that you put the water in with the sugar before any spirit goes in, because the spirit doesn't want to let it dissolve. And I will always remember that because of a time I stood over a punch bowl for a very long time, stirring some brandy and sugar. It doesn't well. And so, and then after that, you're probably going to see more citrus going in, maybe some juice, your spirit. The most popular is usually some combination of brandy and rum, but then you get whiskey as a workaround. There's gin as a workaround on some. There's other ones that include things like port or tea. All kinds of things that go in there. And a lot of times you'll have some spice combined with that. Nutmeg's a big one, but you could see some other things in there too. So just kind of an overview. Those are the main factors that are going to go into your punch recipe.
All right. So that's it for questions. Aaron, if you can throw the link to their channel in the chat one more time. And it's back to you, John. We're about out of time.
Yeah, wow. We're about out of time, and we could have talked about so many more things. There's always so much content here. Ciders and Perrys and all these wonderful things besides, the varieties of the great things that are going on with beer that we just don't get, right? So we'll just have to talk about that kind of stuff in the future. So thank you so much, Brian and Amy, for being on the live stream today. It has been very educational, and
Thank you, John.
yeah, thank you. And it's so much, it's fun to go through and look at these different time periods as we concentrate on the 18th century, but those things are coming from, 17th century things. And then we go into the 19th century, and we can see there's a great evolution of things that are going on. So we can learn a lot about what our world is like today by looking at these past time frames. So I super duper enjoy it. Thank you, Ryan, for making the drink and wrestling up all those questions and everything. Wrestling, you know.
Yeah, we wrestled them.
And Aaron, thank you for working on the hard technical end on the other side of the time vortex. Again, thank you, Amy and Brian, and thank you guys out there for all your super duper amazing support for what we do here on the channel. Make sure to check out the channel, the Victorian Bar Room. And thanks for watching today.